In the scorching deserts of the American Southwest, where survival meant more than just finding water, it meant protecting everything you loved from those who would take it. One woman's daily journey to save her dying mother would change two tribes forever. What began as an act of desperate love would become a story of forbidden understanding between ancient enemies, proving that sometimes the most dangerous paths lead to the most unexpected salvation. This is the true story of how a single act of compassion broke through centuries of tribal warfare, and how two souls from opposing worlds discovered that the line between enemy and ally is often as fragile as desert sand in the wind. The sun had barely touched the horizon when Ayanna stepped out of her family's wickiup, the traditional Apache dwelling that had sheltered 3 generations of her bloodline. The morning air carried the sharp bite of desert cold, but she knew that within hours, the same air would shimmer with deadly heat. In her weathered hands, she gripped 2 large clay vessels, their surfaces worn smooth from countless trips to the sacred spring hidden deep in the canyon walls. Behind her, through the animal hide entrance of their home, came the sound that had haunted her sleep for 3 moons now, her mother's labored breathing. Each breath seemed to require more effort than the last, as if the very act of living had become a mountain she had to climb again and again. The tribal medicine man had done what he could with his herbs and rituals, but even his ancient wisdom seemed powerless against whatever sickness had taken hold of her mother's lungs. Ayanna's father had died 2 winters ago in a raid against Mexican settlers who had been stealing Apache horses. Her younger brother had gone with a war party 6 moons past and had not returned. Now it was just her and her mother, Itzel, whose name meant rainbow but whose world had grown as gray as storm clouds. The responsibility of keeping them both alive rested entirely on Ayanna's 22-year-old shoulders. The other women in their band had offered help, as was the Apache way, but Ayanna had refused. Pride ran as deep as mountain roots in her family, and accepting charity felt like admitting defeat. Besides, the spring she had discovered was her secret, her gift to her mother. The water that flowed from its hidden source was cleaner and colder than any other in the territory, and Ayanna believed with fierce determination that this pure water might be the key to bringing her mother back from the edge of death. As she walked through the sleeping camp, her moccasined feet silent on the hard-packed earth, Ayanna passed the other families beginning their daily routines. Children who should have been playing and laughing instead helped their parents prepare for another day of survival in a world that seemed determined to crush the Apache people. The United States Army had been pushing deeper into their territory, forcing the bands to move constantly, never allowing them to rest long enough to truly call any place home. The path to her secret spring led through terrain that would challenge even experienced Apache scouts. She had to climb over boulder fields that could turn an ankle with one wrong step, navigate through narrow passages where the walls seemed to close in like grasping fingers, and cross areas where loose rock could trigger slides that would bury an unwary traveler. But Ayanna knew every stone, every handhold, every safe route through what others might consider impassable country. She had discovered the spring during a vision quest when she was 17, a time when young Apache women sought spiritual guidance for their adult lives. While other girls her age found visions of marriage and children, Ayanna's spirit guide had led her to this hidden place of pure water flowing from the heart of the mountain. At the time, she had not understood why the spirits would show her this particular gift, but now its purpose seemed clear. The climb began before the sun had fully risen, and Ayanna moved with the efficient grace that marked all her people. The Apache had learned to move like shadows across their harsh homeland, conserving energy while covering ground quickly and quietly. Every step was placed with purpose, every movement calculated to avoid drawing attention from the predators that hunted in these desert mountains, both animal and human. As she climbed higher, the familiar landmarks guided her way. There was the twisted juniper tree that looked like an old warrior raising his arms to the sky. Beyond that, the rock formation that resembled a sleeping bear guarded the entrance to the narrow canyon that led to her destination. Each of these markers had meaning in Apache tradition, part of the sacred geography that connected her people to the land that had shaped them for countless generations. The canyon itself was a place of strange beauty, its walls carved by wind and water into shapes that seemed to tell stories of ancient times. Red and gold stone rose on both sides of the narrow passage, creating a corridor that felt separate from the outside world. Here, the harsh desert gave way to an almost mystical landscape where time seemed to flow differently. Ayana had to squeeze through a gap between two massive boulders to reach the final stretch of her journey. This natural doorway was so narrow that she had to turn sideways and exhale completely to pass through, the clay vessels held high above her head to keep them from breaking against the stone. On the other side lay the hidden chamber where her spring waited. The space opened up like a secret room carved by the gods themselves. Smooth walls curved upward to form a natural dome, and, in the center, water bubbled up from unknown depths to form a pool of crystalline perfection. The spring never ran dry, never grew warm, never showed any signs of the contamination that plagued other water sources in the region. Sunlight filtering down through cracks in the ceiling created shifting patterns of light on the water's surface, making it seem alive with dancing spirits. Ayana knelt beside the pool with the reverence her grandmother had taught her to show all sacred places. She whispered a prayer of gratitude to the water spirits, asking them to bless this precious gift and to carry her mother's healing through every drop. Then, with careful movements, she submerged the first clay vessel. The water was so cold it made her hands ache, but Ayana welcomed the sensation. This was life itself flowing into her containers, pure, clean life that might yet save the most important person in her world. She filled both vessels completely, then used her cupped hands to drink deeply from the spring. The water tasted of mineral and mountain stone, with an underlying sweetness that seemed to refresh not just her body but her spirit as well. The journey back would be even more challenging than the climb up, as she now carried the added weight of the filled vessels. But this was a burden she carried gladly, knowing that each careful step brought her closer to her mother's bedside. The water would still be cold when she arrived, would still carry whatever healing power the mountain spirits had blessed it with. As she began her descent, Ayana felt the familiar mixture of hope and fear that accompanied each of these journeys. Hope that today's water might be the dose that finally turned her mother's illness around, fear that she might return to find that all her efforts had been too late. But she pushed the dark thoughts away, focusing instead on the precious cargo she carried and the love that drove her to risk this dangerous journey day after day. The sun was climbing higher now, and the desert was beginning to show its true face. Heat waves would soon rise from the rocks, making the air shimmer like water. Rattlesnakes would emerge from their cool hiding places to hunt for prey. Mountain lions would seek shade in the very canyons Ayana had to navigate. But she had been making this trip for nearly a month now, and she knew how to move safely through her homeland's dangers. What Ayana did not know was that on this particular morning, she was not traveling alone through the seemingly empty wilderness. High on a ridge that offered a commanding view of the entire canyon system, a Comanche warrior named Dakota sat motionless astride his paint horse, watching her every move through eyes that held no hatred, only curiosity and something that might have been respect. Dakota had been tracking a group of Mexican horse thieves when he first spotted the lone Apache woman making her impossible journey to the secret spring. That had been 5 days ago, and, each morning since, he had positioned himself on this same ridge to observe her ritual. As a Comanche, he should have seen her as an enemy to be captured or killed, but something about her solitary courage had captured his attention in a way that troubled and intrigued him. The Comanche and Apache had been enemies for as long as tribal memory could recall, their conflicts over hunting grounds and horses creating a legacy of bloodshed that stretched back through generations. But, as Dakota watched this unknown woman risk her life daily for reasons he could not fathom, he found himself questioning assumptions he had never thought to challenge. He could see the care with which she moved, the reverence she showed for the hidden spring, the determination that drove her to repeat this dangerous journey despite the obvious risks. There was something sacred about her mission, something that transcended the tribal hatred that had been bred into his bones. For the first time in his 26 years, Dakota found himself seeing an Apache not as prey or enemy, but as a human being whose courage commanded respect. As Ayana began her careful descent with the precious water, Dakota made a decision that would have shocked his Comanche brothers and probably resulted in his exile from the tribe if they knew about it. Instead of returning to his own people with intelligence about Apache movements in this area, he would continue to watch over this mysterious woman who had somehow captured his warriors' respect. There was danger in this choice, not just the risk of being discovered by Apache scouts, but the deeper danger of allowing his enemy to become human in his eyes. Once that line was crossed, everything he had been taught about the natural order of tribal warfare would begin to crumble. But something in his spirit told him this woman's story was connected to his own destiny in ways he could not yet understand. As Ayanna disappeared into the maze of canyons below, carrying her burden of hope and healing water, Dakota remained on his ridge, knowing he would return tomorrow to continue this strange vigil. Neither of them realized yet that their lives had already become intertwined, that the daily journey of one desperate daughter would soon become a bridge between two worlds that had known only conflict for generations uncounted. For 7 days, the pattern continued unchanged. Each dawn brought Ayanna from her mother's bedside to begin the treacherous journey to the sacred spring, and each dawn found Dakota positioned on his overlooking ridge, watching her movements with the trained eye of a warrior who had been taught to notice everything that might mean life or death in the unforgiving landscape of the Southwest. On the 8th day, everything changed. Ayanna had noticed subtle signs that morning that spoke to her Apache-trained senses of coming danger. The birds were not singing their usual dawn chorus. Small animals that normally scurried about in the early hours were nowhere to be seen. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, as if the desert itself was waiting for something terrible to unfold. But her mother's condition had worsened during the night, and desperation overruled caution. Eitzel's breathing had become so shallow that Ayanna had to lean close to her mother's chest to confirm she still lived. The fever that had been building for days now made her mother's skin burn to the touch, and she spoke in delirious whispers to people who had crossed over to the spirit world years ago. The medicine man had visited the previous evening, and the expression in his ancient eyes had told Ayanna everything she needed to know about her mother's chances. Without actually speaking the words, he had prepared her for the possibility that this might be among the last trips she would make to the spring. The thought drove her forward with an urgency that made her take risks she normally would have avoided. She moved faster than usual through the dangerous terrain, her feet finding purchase on loose rock that could have sent her tumbling into the canyon depths below. The clay vessels felt heavier this morning, though she knew their weight had not changed. Everything about this day felt different, charged with an energy that made her skin prickle and her heart beat faster than the exertion alone could explain. From his position on the ridge, Dakota also sensed that something was wrong. His horse shifted nervously beneath him, ears swiveling to catch sounds that human ears could not detect. Years of warfare had taught him to trust these subtle warnings, and he found himself studying the landscape around Ayanna's route with new intensity. That was when he saw them. 3 Mexican raiders were working their way along a parallel canyon, clearly intending to intercept the Apache woman at a narrow passage where escape would be impossible. Dakota recognized them as part of a larger group that had been terrorizing both Apache and Comanche settlements, stealing horses and capturing women and children to sell as slaves in the markets farther south. The Mexicans moved with the confidence of men who believed they had found easy prey. They had obviously been watching Ayanna's daily routine just as Dakota had, waiting for the right moment to spring their trap. The narrow passage they had chosen was perfect for their purposes, high walls on both sides, no alternate routes, and far enough from any Apache settlement that her screams would not be heard. For a moment that felt like an eternity, Dakota sat frozen by the conflict raging in his warrior's heart. By all the laws of tribal warfare, he should either stay hidden and let events unfold naturally, or even join the Mexicans in capturing an Apache enemy. The woman below meant nothing to him, she was not of his people, not his responsibility, not his concern. But, as he watched her moving through the canyon with such obvious love and determination, carrying water that might save her dying mother's life, Dakota found that the old rules no longer applied to his heart. Something fundamental had shifted in his understanding during these days of observation, something that made the idea of letting her be captured by slave raiders feel like a betrayal of everything honorable in his own spirit. Before conscious thought could interfere with his decision, Dakota was moving down the steep slope toward the canyon floor, his horse's hooves finding purchase on rock faces that would have defeated most riders. He left his mount hidden behind a cluster of boulders and continued on foot, his war club and knife ready for the fight that was now inevitable. Ayanna had just entered the narrow passage when she heard the first sounds of approaching danger. Pebbles rattling down from above, the soft scrape of leather against stone, the barely audible sound of men trying to move quietly through terrain that amplified every careless step. Her Apache training kicked in immediately, and she pressed herself against the canyon wall, hoping to become invisible in the morning shadows. But there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, and no way to defend herself while carrying the precious water vessels. The passage ahead curved around a massive boulder, and she could hear the raiders positioning themselves just beyond that turn, waiting for her to walk into their trap. The first Mexican appeared around the boulder with the grinning confidence of a predator who had cornered his prey. He was a lean man with scars that spoke of many fights, his clothes a mixture of stolen Apache and Mexican garments. The rifle in his hands was trained directly on Ayanna's chest, and his eyes held the cold calculation of someone who saw her not as a human being but as valuable merchandise. "Buenos dias, Apache," he called out in Spanish, though he knew she likely understood him. "You will come with us now, and, if you are wise, you will not make this difficult." Two more men appeared behind him, effectively blocking any retreat. Ayanna set the water vessels carefully on the ground, her mind racing through options that all seemed to end in capture or death. She reached for the knife at her belt, knowing it would be little use against three armed men but determined not to be taken without a fight. That was when the war cry echoed off the canyon walls, not Apache, but the distinctive battle shout of a Comanche warrior. The Mexicans spun around in confusion, trying to locate this new threat, and, in that moment of distraction, death came for them with the swift precision of a mountain lion taking prey. Dakota dropped from the canyon wall above like a striking hawk, his war club crushing the skull of the lead raider before the man could raise his rifle. The second Mexican managed to get off one wild shot that echoed like thunder in the confined space, but Dakota was already moving, his knife finding the soft spot below the ribs with the practiced skill of a warrior who had killed many enemies in close combat. The third raider turned to run, but there was nowhere to go in the narrow passage. Dakota's thrown knife caught him between the shoulder blades, and he fell forward onto the rocky ground, his blood painting the ancient stone where countless other violent ends had been written in red. In the sudden silence that followed, Ayanna found herself staring at a Comanche warrior who should have been her enemy but had just saved her life. Dakota stood among the bodies of the dead Mexicans, breathing hard from the brief but intense fight, his dark eyes meeting hers across a cultural divide that seemed as vast as the desert sky. Neither of them moved for long moments. Apache and Comanche had been killing each other for so many generations that hatred should have been automatic, instinctive, as natural as breathing. But, standing there in the aftermath of violence, surrounded by the blood of their common enemies, both warriors felt something neither had expected: recognition of a kindred spirit. Dakota was the first to break the silence. In halting Apache words learned from captives his tribe had taken over the years, he said, "You are not hurt?" Ayanna shook her head slowly, still trying to process what had just happened. "No," she replied in her own language, then switched to the trade Spanish that both tribes sometimes used for communication with outsiders. "I am not hurt. Why did you help me?" It was a question Dakota could not answer, even to himself. All he knew was that watching her dedication to her mother's care over these past days had awakened something in his warrior's heart that demanded protection rather than conquest. "I have been watching," he admitted. "Every day, you make this journey. For someone you love." The admission that he had been observing her should have filled Ayanna with fear, but, instead she felt a strange sense of rightness, as if some part of her had known she was not alone during those dangerous trips. "My mother is dying," she said simply. "The water from the sacred spring, it is her only hope. Dakota nodded, understanding flowing between them despite the language barriers and tribal hostilities that should have made such communication impossible. Love for family was something any warrior could understand, regardless of which tribe they called home. "The spring," he said. "It is far." "Not far, but—" Ayanna gestured at the 3 dead men and the spreading pools of blood. "There may be more. These raiders, they travel in larger groups." This was true, and both warriors knew it. The narrow escape they had just survived might be only the beginning of their troubles. If other members of the raiding party found the bodies, they would track both Ayanna and her unexpected Comanche protector with all the fury that dead comrades could inspire. Dakota made another decision that would have shocked his tribal brothers. "I will watch the trail," he said. "You get your water. Then, we must both leave this place quickly." The offer of continued protection from an enemy warrior left Ayanna speechless. In the space of a few minutes, everything she thought she knew about the world had been turned upside down. But her mother's need drove her forward, and she gathered up her clay vessels with hands that trembled only slightly. "Thank you," she said in Spanish, the inadequate words carrying depths of meaning that both warriors understood. Then, she hurried toward the hidden spring, leaving Dakota to keep watch over the canyon approaches. As he positioned himself where he could observe any approaching threats, Dakota wrestled with the implications of what he had done. By saving an Apache woman, by offering her protection, by treating her as someone deserving of a warrior's aid rather than a warrior's hostility, he had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. If his Comanche brothers discovered his actions, he would be branded a traitor to his own people. If Apache warriors found him here, they would kill him without question, regardless of how he had helped one of their women. He was now caught between 2 worlds, belonging fully to neither, committed to a course of action that made sense only to his heart. But, as he listened to the sound of Ayanna carefully filling her vessels at the sacred spring, Dakota found he had no regrets. Some things transcended tribal law, and the courage of a daughter fighting to save her mother's life was one of them. Whatever consequences came from this choice, he would face them with the same warrior's pride that had driven him to make it. When Ayanna returned with her filled water vessels, she found Dakota had dragged the bodies of the dead raiders into a side canyon where they would not be immediately visible to anyone following the main trail. It was a practical precaution that might buy them precious time to escape whatever vengeance was surely coming. "There are tracks," he reported quietly. 6 more men, maybe 7. "They will find this place before the sun reaches high noon." Ayanna felt ice in her veins despite the warming morning air. 9 or 10 Mexican raiders was a formidable force, more than enough to hunt down both her and her unlikely protector. "I must return to my people," she said. "My mother cannot wait longer for this water." Dakota nodded, understanding the impossible choice she faced. Return to her people quickly and risk leading the raiders to her entire band, or try to lose the pursuit and risk arriving too late to save her mother's life. It was the kind of decision that could haunt a warrior's dreams for the rest of their days. "I know ways," he said finally. "Paths the Mexicans will not think to follow. Dangerous paths, but—" He shrugged, the gesture encompassing all the risks they now faced together. The offer hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither fully understood. To accept his guidance would mean trusting her life to a Comanche warrior, traveling alone with someone who should have been her enemy through country where they could be killed by either of their tribes if discovered together. But, as Ayanna looked into Dakota's eyes, she saw something that transcended tribal identity, the soul of a true warrior, someone who understood honor and would die before breaking his word. Her mother was counting on her, and this stranger had already proven his willingness to risk everything to help her succeed in her mission. "Show me," she said. The route Dakota chose defied everything Ayanna thought she knew about traveling through the desert mountains. Instead of following the obvious trails that connected canyon systems, he led her along precarious ledges that seemed to exist only in the imagination, across rock faces where one misplaced foot would mean a fall into empty air, through passages so narrow they had to move single file with their shoulders brushing stone walls that had been carved by wind and water over countless centuries. The Comanche warrior moved through this impossible terrain with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to read the land like other men read tracks in sand. Every handhold he chose was solid, every step he took landed on firm footing, every route he selected avoided the loose rock that could betray their presence to anyone following below. Ayanna found herself trusting his guidance with an intensity that would have amazed her if she had stopped to think about it. Behind them, growing closer with each passing hour, came the sounds of pursuit. The remaining Mexican raiders had found their dead companions and were now tracking the fugitives with the relentless determination of men whose pride had been wounded along with their numbers. Their voices carried on the desert wind, angry Spanish curses mixed with promises of what they would do when they caught the Apache woman and her mysterious protector. "They are good trackers," Dakota admitted as they paused on a ledge barely wide enough for one person, pressed against the rock face while a formation of buzzards circled overhead. "But they think like men who travel on horses. They will not imagine we would attempt this path." Ayanna peered over the edge of their precarious perch and immediately regretted it. Far below, the canyon floor looked like a collection of tiny rocks scattered by a child's hand. The clay vessels of sacred water felt impossibly heavy, and her arms ached from carrying them across terrain that challenged every muscle in her body. But her mother's face rose in her memory, not as the fever-racked woman she had left behind, but as the strong warrior woman who had taught her daughter that Apache women never gave up, no matter how impossible the obstacles seemed. "How much farther?" she asked, though she already knew the answer would not be encouraging. They were taking a route that curved far around the direct path to her people's camp, adding hours to a journey that needed to be completed as quickly as possible. "Before sunset," Dakota replied. "But..." He hesitated, clearly struggling with something he needed to say but did not want to voice. "Your people. When we arrive. They will not understand why a Comanche warrior travels with you." The words hung between them like a blade waiting to fall. Ayanna had been so focused on reaching her mother that she had not fully considered the reception that awaited them at her band's camp. Apache warriors who saw a Comanche approaching with one of their women would shoot first and ask questions never. The fact that Dakota had saved her life would mean nothing if he was dead before she could explain what had happened. "There is a place," she said slowly, thinking through the geography of her homeland. "A grove of cottonwood trees near the stream that runs behind our camp. You could wait there while I..." She paused, trying to find words for what seemed like an impossible situation. "While I speak to my war chief." "Alone?" Dakota nodded, though both of them understood the risks in such a plan. Apache scouts would be watching all the approaches to their camp, and a lone Comanche warrior hiding in nearby trees would be discovered quickly. But the alternative, approaching the camp together, would almost certainly end in Dakota's death and possibly Ayanna's as well, if her people decided she had betrayed them to their enemies. They continued climbing through country that seemed to exist at the edge of the world. The sun climbed higher, turning the rock faces into furnaces that radiated heat like the breath of angry spirits. Sweat stung Ayanna's eyes and made the clay vessels slippery in her hands, but she maintained her grip through pure determination. The sacred water inside those vessels represented her mother's only chance at life, and she would carry them safely if she had to crawl the remaining distance on her hands and knees. Dakota moved ahead of her, testing each route before gesturing for her to follow. His efficiency spoke of years spent learning to survive in country that killed the unprepared, but there was something more in his movements, a consideration for her safety that went beyond simple courtesy between traveling companions. He was protecting her not just from immediate dangers, but from risks she might not notice until it was too late. When loose rock began to slide under her feet during one particularly treacherous crossing, Dakota's hand was instantly there to steady her, his grip strong enough to prevent a fall that could have been fatal. When a rattlesnake coiled in the shade of a boulder raised its warning sound, he positioned his body between Ayanna and the threat while carefully guiding them around the danger. Each gesture was small, but together they painted a picture of someone who had committed himself completely to her safety. "Why?" she asked during one of their brief rests, the question emerging from thoughts she had been wrestling with since he first appeared to save her from the Mexican raiders. "Why risk everything for someone you do not know?" Dakota was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, as if he was discovering their truth even as he voiced them. "My grandmother told stories," he said. "About times before the hatred, when Apache and Comanche spoke as brothers around the same fires. She said war made us forget that we are all children of the same sky." The words carried weight beyond their simple meaning. Both warriors had been raised on stories of the endless conflict between their peoples, taught from childhood that the other tribe represented everything evil and dangerous in their world. But here they were, Apache and Comanche, working together to preserve life instead of dealing death, proving that the old stories of permanent enmity might not be the whole truth. "Your grandmother was wise," Ayanna said. "My grandmother told similar stories. But our war chiefs would say such thinking is weakness." "Perhaps," Dakota agreed. "But weakness that saves life seems stronger than strength that only brings death." Their conversation was interrupted by the distant sound of voices echoing off canyon walls. The Mexican raiders were closer than either had hoped, their pursuit more determined and skillful than expected. Both warriors understood immediately that their enemies had found some way to follow the seemingly impossible trail they had been blazing through the mountains. "How?" Ayanna whispered, voicing the question that bewildered them both. The route they had taken should have been untrackable, requiring local knowledge and climbing skills that few possessed. Dakota's expression darkened as understanding dawned. "They have a guide," he said grimly. "Someone who knows this country as well as we do." The implications were terrifying. If the raiders had recruited a local guide, perhaps an Apache or Comanche scout who had been captured and forced to cooperate, then no route would be safe, no hiding place secure. Their enemies would be able to anticipate their movements, cut off escape routes, and eventually corner them in places where fighting would be impossible. "We must move faster," Dakota said, though both of them were already pushing their endurance to its limits. "And we must be prepared to fight." Ayanna nodded, adjusting her grip on the precious water vessels. The thought of having to defend herself while carrying her mother's medicine filled her with dread, but there seemed to be no alternative. The raiders would never give up their pursuit, and there were still hours of dangerous travel ahead before they could reach the relative safety of Apache territory. They pushed forward with new urgency, taking risks that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. Handholds that should have been tested were trusted on first touch. Ledges that should have been crossed carefully were navigated at near-running speed. Each step became a gamble with gravity and fate, but the growing sounds of pursuit left them no choice but to embrace danger in hopes of staying ahead of a worse death. The sacred water sloshed gently in its clay containers as they moved, reminding Ayanna of the precious cargo she carried and the life that depended on her reaching home safely. Her mother's face seemed to float before her eyes, not the fever-racked invalid she had become, but the strong woman who had taught her daughter to never surrender, no matter how hopeless the situation might seem. There, Dakota pointed ahead to where their treacherous path finally began to descend toward more familiar territory. "From that ridge, we can see your people's camp." The ridge he indicated was still at least an hour away across terrain that offered little cover from watching eyes. If the raiders caught them in that open stretch, there would be nowhere to hide and nowhere to run. Everything would depend on speed and the hope that their enemies would be slowed by the same obstacles that had been challenging the fugitives all day. But, as they prepared to make the final push toward safety, both warriors knew that the most dangerous part of their journey still lay ahead. Reaching Ayanna's people would only solve half their problems. They would still need to find a way to explain how an Apache woman and a Comanche warrior had come to travel together through country where such alliances were supposed to be impossible. Behind them, the voices of their pursuers grew louder, more confident, as if the raiders sensed that their quarry was finally within reach. The hunt was entering its final phase, and both predator and prey understood that the next few hours would determine whether this extraordinary partnership between traditional enemies would end in triumph or tragedy. As they began their descent toward the valley where Ayana's people waited unknowingly for her return, both warriors carried the weight of more than just sacred water and personal survival. They carried the fragile possibility that understanding might bloom between peoples who had known only conflict, that courage and compassion might prove stronger than generations of inherited hatred. The sun was beginning its afternoon slide toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades that reminded both Apache and Comanche of the blood that had been spilled between their tribes. But it also painted the world in colors that spoke of hope, of new beginnings, of the possibility that even the deepest wounds could heal if the right medicine was applied with enough faith and determination. Whether that medicine would be found in a clay vessel of sacred spring water or in the unprecedented alliance between two enemy warriors remained to be seen. But, as they moved through the final stretch of their impossible journey, both Ayana and Dakota felt that they were participating in something larger than their own survival, something that might change the way their people saw each other for generations to come. The Apache camp came into view just as the sun reached its highest point, casting sharp shadows that turned the familiar landscape into something alien and threatening. From their position on the overlooking ridge, Ayana could see her people going about their daily routines, women tending cooking fires, children playing games that taught them the skills they would need as adults, men working on weapons and gear that might mean the difference between life and death in their dangerous world. Everything looked normal, peaceful even, but Ayana knew that appearance was deceptive. Apache camps were never truly at rest. Scouts would be positioned on every approach, watching for threats that could appear without warning. War parties might be preparing to depart, or returning from raids that had taken them deep into enemy territory. At any moment, the tranquil scene below could explode into the controlled chaos of a band preparing for fight or flight. "Your war chief," Dakota said quietly, studying the camp through the eyes of someone trained to assess military threats. "He is a man who listens, or a man who acts first?" It was a crucial question, and Ayana found herself struggling to answer it fairly. Red Eagle was respected among their people for his wisdom and courage, but he was also a product of generations of warfare with the Comanche. His first instinct upon seeing a traditional enemy would be to reach for his weapons, not his capacity for understanding. "He is careful," she said finally. "He protects our people above all else." But he knew my grandmother, who told the old stories about times when Apache and Comanche were not always enemies. The qualification was important, though both warriors understood how little protection it might offer when faced with the reality of a Comanche warrior appearing in Apache territory. Stories from the distant past would carry little weight against the immediate evidence of traditional enmity. They made their way down toward the cottonwood grove that Ayana had identified as a hiding place for Dakota. The trees grew thick along the stream that provided water for the Apache camp, their broad leaves creating patches of shade that would offer concealment from casual observation. But both warriors knew that any Apache scout worthy of the name would search such obvious hiding places within hours of learning that strangers might be in the area. "If they discover you before I can speak to Red Eagle," Ayana said as they reached the edge of the grove, "you must not fight them. Promise me this. One Comanche warrior cannot survive against 20 Apache fighters, and your death would destroy any chance of making them understand what happened." Dakota's warrior pride bristled at the suggestion that he should surrender without fighting, but he recognized the wisdom in her words. Death would solve nothing, while survival, even as a prisoner, might at least preserve the possibility of explanation and, perhaps, understanding. "I promise," he said, though the words came hard to someone trained from childhood to die fighting rather than submit to capture. "But, if they threaten you because of my presence?" "They will not," Ayana interrupted, though she was far from certain this was true. Apache justice could be harsh when it came to perceived betrayal, and traveling with a Comanche warrior might be seen as exactly that, regardless of the circumstances that had brought them together. As they prepared to separate, both warriors felt the weight of everything that had passed between them during their impossible journey. In the space of a single day, they had moved from enemy to ally to something deeper, partners in a venture that transcended tribal loyalty and traditional hatred. Neither could have imagined such a transformation when the sun rose that morning, but both recognized it as real and precious despite its improbability. "When this is finished," Dakota said, "when your mother is healed and the raiders are no longer a threat, what then?" It was a question Ayanna had been avoiding, though it had been growing in her mind throughout their shared ordeal. What did happen when Apache and Comanche discovered they could trust each other, could work together, could see past generations of conditioned hatred to recognize common humanity? Such discoveries had implications that reached far beyond two individual warriors. "I do not know," she admitted. "But I believe we will find an answer worthy of what we have shared today." She left him hidden among the cottonwoods and made her way toward the camp, the clay vessels of sacred water heavy in her arms and her heart pounding with more than just exertion. Every step took her closer to her dying mother, but also closer to a confrontation that could end in disaster for everyone involved. The first Apache scout to spot her was her cousin, Standing Bear, a young warrior who had been trying to court her before her family's troubles began. His face brightened with relief when he recognized her, but quickly clouded with concern as he noticed her disheveled appearance and the lateness of her return. "Ayanna. We feared you had been taken by raiders. There are tracks throughout the canyon country, signs of fighting." He moved toward her with the protective instincts of someone who cared deeply about her welfare. "I am safe," she said quickly, not wanting to lie to him but also not ready to explain the full truth of her morning's adventures. "But I must reach my mother quickly. The water cannot wait." Standing Bear nodded, understanding the urgency of her mission, but his scout's eyes continued to study her appearance with growing concern. There were scrapes on her hands and arms that spoke of difficult climbing, dust on her clothes that suggested she had traveled far from her usual route, and something in her expression that hinted at experiences she was not yet ready to share. "The camp is worried about the raiders," he said as they walked together toward her family's wickiup. 3 Apache from the Red Rock Band were found dead near the border canyon. "Mexican raiders, we think, but they were killed by someone skilled in close combat. The war chief thinks it might have been a Comanche raiding party moving through our territory." Ayanna's blood chilled at the news. If Apache warriors believed Comanche fighters were active in the area, they would be scanning every hiding place within miles of the camp. Dakota's presence in the cottonwood grove would be discovered within hours, and his death would follow quickly unless she could find some way to prevent it. "Standing Bear," she said carefully, "if the raiders are still active, should we not focus our efforts on protecting our own people rather than hunting for Comanche who might not even exist?" Her cousin gave her a sharp look, surprised by what seemed like an unusual attitude for an Apache warrior's daughter. "The Comanche are always our enemies," he said firmly. "If they are in our territory, they must be found and killed before they can attack our families." The certainty in his voice reminded Ayanna of how deep the tribal hatreds ran, how difficult it would be to convince her people that their traditional enemies might sometimes be allies rather than threats. But her mother's need drove her forward, and she quickened her pace toward the wickiup where Itzel lay waiting for the medicine that might save her life. The family dwelling looked smaller than she remembered, as if the sickness inside had somehow diminished the entire structure. The hide entrance flap hung motionless in the still air, and no sounds of life came from within. For a terrifying moment, Ayanna feared she had arrived too late, that her mother had crossed over to the spirit world while her daughter was away on her dangerous mission. But, when she pushed through the entrance, she found Itzel still breathing, though each breath seemed to require enormous effort. The fever had broken sometime during the morning, leaving her mother's skin pale and damp with perspiration. Her eyes opened when Ayanna knelt beside her, and recognition flickered in their depths. "My daughter," Itzel whispered, her voice barely audible. "You have returned." "I have brought the sacred water, Mother," Ayanna said, lifting one of the clay vessels with hands that trembled from more than just exhaustion. fresh from the mountain spring, blessed by the water spirits for your healing. She helped her mother sit up enough to drink, supporting Itzel's weight while carefully tipping the vessel to her lips. The water was still cool despite the heat of the day, still carrying whatever power the hidden spring had blessed it with. Itzel drank deeply, and some color seemed to return to her cheeks with each swallow. "It tastes of the mountain," her mother murmured after she had drunk her fill. "Of stone and sky and the breath of spirits. Where did you find such water?" Ayana found herself reluctant to reveal the location of her secret spring, though she could not have explained why. Some instinct told her that knowledge of the hidden place should remain her secret, at least until she better understood the implications of everything that had happened that day. "A place the spirits showed me," she said, which was true enough without being complete. "A place where healing water flows from the heart of our homeland." Itzel nodded, accepting the explanation with the faith of someone who had lived long enough to know that the spirit world worked in mysterious ways. Already, the sacred water seemed to be having an effect. Her breathing was easier, her color better, and her eyes held a clarity that had been missing for weeks. "There is something else," she said, studying her daughter's face with the perception that only comes from deep love and intimate knowledge. "Something that has changed you today. I can see it in your eyes." Ayana felt exposed under her mother's searching gaze, as if Itzel could see through to the secret she was carrying, the impossible alliance with a Comanche warrior, the growing understanding that traditional enemies might sometimes become something more. But, before she could formulate any kind of response, voices outside the wickiup announced the arrival of visitors. "Ayana," came the commanding voice of Red Eagle, the war chief whose authority extended over every aspect of tribal life. "Come outside. There are matters we must discuss." She exchanged a glance with her mother, seeing understanding pass between them without words. Itzel had survived too many years in a dangerous world to be fooled by her daughter's evasions. She knew that whatever had happened during Ayana's journey that morning had been far from routine. "Go," her mother said softly. "Face what must be faced. And, remember that sometimes the greatest courage lies not in fighting, but in finding reasons not to fight." The word seemed to carry prophetic weight, though Ayana could not have said why. As she prepared to step outside and confront whatever questions Red Eagle had brought to her doorstep, she felt the burden of two lives resting on her shoulders, her mother's, which she had worked so hard to save, and Dakota's, which now depended on her ability to bridge a gap that had seemed unbridgeable when the sun rose that morning. Outside the wickiup, Red Eagle waited with three of his most trusted warriors, their expressions serious but not yet hostile. The war chief was a man of middle years whose face bore the scars of many battles and whose eyes held the weight of countless decisions that had meant life or death for his people. When he looked at Ayana, she felt the full force of his authority and intelligence focused upon her. "Standing Bear tells me you returned later than usual today," Red Eagle said without preamble. "He also tells me you appear to have traveled through difficult country, far from your normal route to the spring." Ayana inclined her head respectfully, knowing that lies would be worse than useless with someone of Red Eagle's experience. "The normal route was blocked," she said carefully. "I had to find another way." "Blocked how?" The question hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall. Everything depended on how she answered, how much truth she was willing to reveal, how skillfully she could navigate between honesty and the protection of someone who had risked everything to save her life. In the cottonwood grove not far away, Dakota waited for a salvation that only she could provide, while around her stood Apache warriors who would kill him without hesitation if they discovered his presence. The moment of truth had arrived, and Ayana realized that her next words would determine not just the fate of two individuals, but possibly the future relationship between two tribes that had known only warfare for longer than living memory could recall. "Mexican raiders," Ayana said, the truth falling from her lips like stones into still water. "3 of them, waiting in the narrow canyon where they thought to trap me." Red Eagle's expression hardened immediately, and the warriors around him shifted their grips on their weapons. The presence of slave raiders in Apache territory was a threat that demanded immediate action, but the war chief's tactical mind was already working through the implications of what Ayanna had just revealed. "You escaped 3 armed men alone?" he asked, his tone carrying both skepticism and grudging admiration. "How?" This was the moment Ayanna had dreaded, the point where truth and tribal loyalty seemed to diverge like paths leading to different destinations. Everything she had been taught about Apache honor demanded that she protect those who had protected her, but everything she had been taught about Apache survival suggested that revealing Takota's existence would be catastrophic. "I was not alone," she said finally, the words feeling like stones in her throat. "Someone helped me." The silence that followed her admission seemed to stretch for eternity. Red Eagle's eyes never left her face, reading the expressions that played across her features like clouds moving across the desert sky. Around them, the normal sounds of camp life continued, but the small circle of warriors felt separated from that everyday world by the weight of what was being revealed. "Who?" Red Eagle asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded warriors through countless life and death situations. Ayanna looked at each of the men surrounding her, Standing Bear with his concern and confusion, the other warriors with their growing suspicion, Red Eagle with his implacable demand for truth. All of them were good men, brave fighters who had risked their lives countless times to protect their people. But all of them had been shaped by generations of warfare that made certain alliances unthinkable. "A Comanche warrior," she said, the words falling into the circle like lightning strikes. The reaction was immediate and violent. Standing Bear's hand went to his knife, while the other warriors raised their weapons and began scanning the surrounding area for threats. Red Eagle alone remained motionless, his sharp eyes fixed on Ayanna with an intensity that seemed to peer into her soul. "Explain," he commanded, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade through leather. Quickly and completely. So Ayanna told the story, the daily journeys to save her mother, the watchers she had sensed but not seen, the attack by the Mexican raiders and the unexpected intervention by someone who should have been her enemy. She spoke of the impossible journey through country that only the most skilled could navigate, of the protection offered by a warrior who risked everything for someone he did not know, of conversations that bridged tribal hatreds through shared understanding of honor and family loyalty. As she spoke, she watched the faces around her, seeing disbelief give way to confusion, confusion to careful consideration. These were not foolish men, despite their initial hostility. They understood courage when they saw it, and they recognized that Ayanna's story required a kind of bravery that went beyond simple physical prowess. "Where is this Comanche now?" Red Eagle asked when she had finished her account. "Hidden near the camp," Ayanna admitted, knowing that concealment was no longer possible. "Waiting to see if Apache warriors can look beyond old hatreds to recognize a debt of honor." Red Eagle was quiet for a long moment, his weathered face showing nothing of his thoughts. Around them, the camp continued its daily routines, but Ayanna could sense the change in atmosphere, the way word was already spreading that something unprecedented was happening at the War Chief's Council. "Standing Bear," Red Eagle said finally, "take 2 men and search the cottonwood grove. Bring this Comanche to me, alive and unharmed. Any warrior who spills blood without my command will answer to me personally." The young scout's face showed his confusion, but he was too well trained to question direct orders from his war chief. As he departed with his companions, Red Eagle turned back to Ayanna with an expression that seemed to carry the weight of generations. "You understand what you have done?" he asked quietly. "The path you have opened?" "I understand that a brave warrior saved my life when he could have let me die," Ayanna replied. "I understand that my mother lives because someone chose honor over hatred. Beyond that." She shrugged, suddenly, feeling the exhaustion of the day's ordeal settling into her bones. "Beyond that lies country none of our people have traveled before," Red Eagle finished for her. "Country where Apache and Comanche might walk as allies instead of enemies. It is dangerous territory, daughter. Full of pitfalls that could destroy both our peoples if we make the wrong choices. Before Ayana could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps announced the return of Standing Bear's search party. They emerged from the cottonwood grove escorting a figure that caused murmurs of amazement and tension throughout the camp, a Comanche warrior walking peacefully among Apache fighters, his weapon surrendered but his dignity intact. Dakota moved with the fluid grace that marked all great warriors, his eyes taking in everything around him while betraying no fear despite being surrounded by traditional enemies. When his gaze found Ayana, she saw relief and, something deeper, pride in her courage, respect for the risks she had taken to honor their alliance. Red Eagle stepped forward to study this unexpected visitor, and Ayana held her breath as the two war leaders took each other's measure. Both men represented the finest traditions of their peoples: courage in battle, wisdom in leadership, absolute commitment to protecting those who depended on them. But they also carried generations of mutual hostility, blood debts that stretched back through countless raids and counter-raids. "You are the one who saved my daughter's life," Red Eagle said in carefully pronounced Comanche, showing that he possessed at least some knowledge of his enemy's language. Dakota inclined his head respectfully. "She fought to save her mother's life," he replied in equally careful Apache words. "Such courage deserves protection, not attack." The simple statement carried profound implications. By acknowledging Ayana's courage rather than claiming credit for saving her, Dakota was showing that he understood Apache values, that he respected the culture he had been taught to hate. It was a gesture of diplomatic sophistication that surprised everyone present. The Mexican raiders, Red Eagle continued, switching to the trade Spanish that both could speak fluently. "There were more than 3? 6 others, perhaps 7, Dakota confirmed. "Still hunting in your territory. Still dangerous to your people and mine." The tactical information was valuable, but more valuable was the way it was offered, freely, without negotiation or demand for reciprocal intelligence. Dakota was demonstrating that he saw the raiders as a common enemy, something that threatened both Apache and Comanche interests. Red Eagle nodded slowly, his strategic mind working through possibilities that would have been unthinkable that morning. "These raiders," he said finally, "they are a threat that requires more warriors than either of our bands can safely spare. But, together." The word hung in the air like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm. Together. Apache and Comanche, traditional enemies becoming temporary allies in the face of a common threat. It was a concept so revolutionary that neither leader seemed quite able to believe they were seriously considering it. "My war chief would need to be convinced," Dakota said carefully. "As would your other warriors. The hatreds run deep in both our peoples. But, not so deep that they cannot be bridged by those willing to take the risk," Ayana interjected, her voice carrying the conviction of someone who had already made that bridge-crossing journey. "You have shown it is possible. Now others must decide if they have the courage to follow." Red Eagle looked at her with something that might have been pride. "You speak wisdom beyond your years, daughter. But, wisdom and survival are not always the same thing." From the crowd of Apache warriors that had gathered to witness this unprecedented encounter, an older man stepped forward. Gray Wolf had been Red Eagle's war leader for more years than most could remember, his counsel valued above all others in matters of strategy and tactics. "War Chief," he said formally, "I request permission to speak." Red Eagle nodded, and Gray Wolf addressed the assembled warriors in a voice that carried clearly across the camp. "I have fought Comanche warriors for 30 seasons, he began. "I have lost brothers, sons, friends to their raids. The hatred in my heart runs as deep as mountain roots." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Gray Wolf's losses to Comanche attacks were legendary, his reasons for hatred better than most. "But," he continued, raising his voice above the murmurs, "I have also seen what happens when enemies become allies against common threats. When the Mexican army invaded our homeland 10 seasons ago, we survived because Apache bands that had been enemies learned to fight together. Perhaps the same wisdom applies now." The suggestion sent shock waves through the assembled warriors. Grey Wolf was known as one of the most traditional voices in the band, someone who usually argued against any deviation from established ways. If he was willing to consider alliance with their oldest enemies, then, perhaps the impossible might become possible. The decision cannot be made by one band alone, Red Eagle said finally. This touches all our people, all their futures. But... He paused, looking at Ayanna and Dakota standing together, Apache and Comanche united by shared trials. But, perhaps it is time to discover whether our peoples can be as brave in peace as they have been in war. Over the following days, a transformation began that would have seemed like madness to previous generations. Dakota was given guest status in the Apache camp, his knowledge of the Mexican raiders' movements proving invaluable in planning defensive strategies. More importantly, his presence began to challenge assumptions that had seemed as permanent as the mountains themselves. Apache children, trained from birth to fear Comanche warriors, discovered that this particular enemy told stories not unlike their own, that he laughed at the same things they found funny, that he showed the same reverence for the spirits that guided all Indian peoples. Apache warriors, watching him demonstrate fighting techniques during training sessions, realized that skill and honor transcended tribal boundaries. Meanwhile, Itzel's recovery continued with each day's dose of sacred water from the hidden spring. The mysterious illness that had nearly claimed her life retreated before the mountain's gift, and, with her renewed strength came a wisdom that helped bridge the cultural gap between her daughter's unprecedented alliance and her people's traditional ways. In my grandmother's time, she told the women who gathered to hear her stories, Apache and Comanche were not always enemies. There was a time when we traded horses and stories, when young warriors from both tribes competed in contests that tested skill rather than dealt death. Perhaps that time can come again, if we have courage enough to remember what we have chosen to forget. The message traveled beyond the Apache camp through the invisible networks that connected all the desert peoples. Comanche scouts, investigating reports of unusual activity in Apache territory, discovered not war preparations but, something far more surprising, evidence of cooperation between traditional enemies. 3 weeks after Ayanna's impossible journey to save her mother's life, a small party of Comanche leaders arrived under a flag of truce to see for themselves what changes were taking place in the world they thought they knew. Among them rode Dakota's own war chief, a man whose reputation for wisdom matched Red Eagle's and whose decision would determine whether a bridge built by 2 young warriors could support the weight of tribal reconciliation. The meeting that followed would become legend among both peoples, not because it ended all hostility, for hatreds that deep could not be erased in a single conversation, but because it established the possibility that Apache and Comanche might someday see each other as something other than eternal enemies. My warrior tells me an Apache woman saved his life, the Comanche war chief said as the leaders sat in council, by trusting him to save hers. He says she carries water from a sacred spring that has the power to heal not just bodies, but the wounds between peoples. Red Eagle nodded gravely. Our daughter has shown us that courage takes many forms. Sometimes the greatest bravery lies not in fighting our enemies, but in discovering that they need not remain enemies forever. The formal negotiations that followed established limited cooperation against the Mexican raiders, shared intelligence about threats to both peoples, and protocols for avoiding the misunderstandings that had so often led to bloodshed in the past. But, more importantly, they established that Apache and Comanche leaders could sit together in peace, could find common ground despite their differences, could begin the long journey toward a future neither had previously dared to imagine. Ayanna continued her daily journeys to the sacred spring, but, now she often traveled in the company of both Apache and Comanche warriors who had volunteered to help protect the precious water source from those who might seek to poison or defile it. The trips became pilgrimages of a sort, journeys that reinforced the fragile peace being built one careful step at a time. Dakota remained as a permanent liaison between the 2 bands, his presence a living symbol of the possibility for change. His relationship with Ayanna deepened beyond alliance into something that transcended tribal boundaries, not just love between 2 individuals, but a bridge between 2 worlds that had been artificially separated by generations of conflict. Do you think it will last? Iona asked him one evening as they sat beside the sacred spring, watching the last light of sunset paint the canyon walls in shades of gold and crimson. "Nothing lasts forever," Dakota replied, his warrior's pragmatism balanced by something deeper. "But, perhaps it will last long enough for our children to build something even stronger. Perhaps each generation will carry the bridge a little farther, until the gap between our peoples is finally closed." The sacred water continued to flow from its hidden source, carrying healing power not just to one dying woman, but to the wounds that had divided two peoples for far too long. And, in the growing understanding between Apache and Comanche, observers might have glimpsed the truth that water had always known, that all streams eventually find their way to the same sea, that all journeys toward understanding, no matter how impossible they seem at the start, can reach their destination if travelers are willing to take the first brave steps into unknown country. In years to come, when storytellers of both tribes recounted the tale of how peace began with a desperate daughter's love for her dying mother, they would always emphasize the moment when two enemies chose to see each other not as threats to be destroyed, but as fellow travelers on paths that proved to lead to the same destination. For in the end, that was the true medicine that flowed from the sacred spring, not just the power to heal bodies, but the power to heal the human heart's capacity for understanding across any divide.